Branch order is one of the most important decisions you'll make in crawl, and I'm going to make it simple. While the first few levels of dungeon are the most dangerous, you don't have many decision points until you get to around D10. At that point, the question is, do I continue or do I go into Lair? And the main decision point, in my opinion, is whether or not you have been shafted or if you can be shafted. If you have, or if you can't be shafted at all, then go on to D11. And if you haven't, and the possibility to be shafted still exists, then only go down to D10 before going into Lair. It's always better to be shafted in Lair while you build up strength than it is to be shafted from D11 onto D13 or 14. This is most likely to get you killed. If you get shafted inside of Lair, you're more than likely going to be able to handle it if you can handle Layer 1. And that will allow you a lot more experience to strengthen up before you get down to D11. In the case where you can't be shafted, you may have Ashen'Zari. And so getting a little more Ashen'Zari piety before you go into Lair is probably the right decision. By the time you're into Lair, you're going to be keeping your eye out on a couple of things. First are the main threats, which are poison, cold damage, and physical damage. The most obvious problem are going to be Hydras and Yak Packs, and those are physical damage. So having higher armor and a shield is really good to prevent them from killing you. The Rime Drakes and the Cane Toads do elemental damages, and so keeping your eye open for resistances to those things in particular is going to frequently save your life when you're working your way through Lair. I generally go from Layer 1 to Layer 5 in one go, but you can always stop at Layer 4 if you're feeling a little threatened and go back to D11 to get a little more experience. At this point, you've probably found some good spells and some good resistances. And so what you want to keep your eye out for on your way to D15 are the new emergence of dangerous undead threats, dragons, and more physical threats around Vault, which is usually D13 or 14. And so you want to have resistance to cold and fire for those dragons, and you want to have a way to deal with skeletons, which means your necromantic magic isn't going to work as well, your ice magic isn't going to work as well. Earth magic is quite good against it. Other physical forms of damage and summons are great for undead. Now, some people like to do Orc after D11 or 12, but I wait till after D15, primarily because of the types of threats we find here. And those are paralysis, summoners, and swarms of enemies. So the three enemies that I'm showing here on the screen are the ones you really want to watch out for. You don't want to be surrounded by swarms of orcs or ogres when you get paralyzed. So you'll want to mouse over these enemies and find out what your chance of being paralyzed actually is. And beyond that, the summoners can bring in demons, which can be hard to fight through unless you're prepared to hit backline enemies. So I like to have the right spells online to do AoE damage, or at least be able to pierce through groups of enemies with things like javelins. After you're done with Orc and Dungeon, it's time to head to the S branches. Which one you choose and in which order can be a little tricky, so we'll deal with each one of those individually. All right, so first let's talk about Snake. I really like Snake. It is a great place to find shields, and I find around this time of the game, maybe I'm still on a buckler, and I'm looking to get a shield with resistances on or a shield with reflect. So this is a great place to go first if you need a shield. The things that you got to watch out for is poison. So some of these enemies have AoE poison. They actually cast the Poison Radiance spell. So you got to have that resistance. It's really critical you have poison resistance for this area. You also have to watch out for the fire and electricity based enemies. So you want to carry resistances to all of those things. And finally, the Guardian Serpents that I show here at the bottom can teleport enemies around you, and they can basically do that every turn, and they like to. So if you have one of these in range, they can pull enemies from off your screen, blink them around you encircling, and then you can escape somehow, say, blink away or move them away somehow, whatever you have. And the very next turn, you can find yourself surrounded again by guardian serpents. So they are a high priority target. You want to get on those as soon as you see them. And do not let yourself get constricted and then beat down by these relatively hard-hitting enemies. Next up is Swamp. So again, poison is a big source of damage here. The Death Drakes in particular shoot miasma breath, and those are incredibly dangerous. So you've got to take those out as a priority. There's a lot of physical heavy hitters in this area too. But most of the damage from at least ranged you're going to be worried about are fire and cold to a lesser extent. The fire damage from these wisps is really deceptive. It looks like foxfire, so there's two of them. They have the same image, but they do 3 dice of damage each. And so if you don't have fire resistance, these things can very quickly whittle you down on their own. And so I have been surprised by needing fire resistance more than almost anything else in the swamp. So keep that in mind. The other thing to watch out for, I mean, there's many, but I guess the main threats here is the Fenstrider Witch, which I'm showing on the right. These guys can paralyze you with pretty high chance. And they themselves can beat you down pretty quickly. They like to paralyze you in groups, obviously. So drink those potions of enlightenment to give you an extra pip of willpower, or be prepared to shut them down or shut down their line of sight at the very least as early as you can. So you want to have poison resist here. I find it's less necessary than in Snake, definitely. A shield helps with the melee dudes, and summons are a big help in this zone to help eat those foxfires or block line of sight against the paralysis. Oh, Spider. This one got buffed a while back and has been a killer of new players for a couple of patches now. The swarms in this area and the new open maps are a real killer if you are weak to physical damage or weak to swarms in general, if you don't have AoE. So there's a number of things you want to be resistant to, electricity included, and poison, of course. But ironically, these spiders are weak to poison themselves. So any type of poison damage can really do a number on the groups. Toxic Radiance in particular can shut down the entire spider branch almost on its own. You got to keep an eye out for the invisible moths, which will drain your mana if you're a spellcaster. So you want see invisible, but also they can't see invisible. So if you drink an invisible potion, you can shut down their ability to drain your mana. The Pharaoh ant in the middle can cause the spiders that you kill to respawn as undead. And they do cold damage or negative damage. So you want to be very careful around all of those enemies and shut them down quickly. Likewise with the Broodmother on the right, which will summon spiders in mass and has a pretty tanky set of defenses, high HP or high armor. And both of those need to be focused down very quickly. All right, so I've saved my least favorite for last in the shoals. So the threats here are cold damage, high amounts of it from range, willpower-based threats from the sirens who can mesmerize you and lock you into their line of sight, and the spear throwers, the javelineers. Their javelins do not check shield, and so if you don't have high EV, you're likely to be taking quite a lot of damage from these enemies. And of course, their spears pierce, which means that summons don't get in the way of their damage. So you definitely want to have cold resist for this area. If you have flying, it really helps because it is a water-infested zone. And so that can really zone you out of different tactical positions if you don't have flying. The shield helps because there are ranged enemies that don't throw javelins. There are quite a few ranged enemies in general in this region. And then, of course, some willpower or clarity really helps with the mesmerizing effect. The other enemies to watch out for are generally high-hitting physical attackers like this alligator snapping turtle, who hits as hard as the krakens do, but is much less obvious when it shows up. It can hide behind other enemies, it has reach, and it has very high defenses. So watch out for those guys, watch out for the Krakens as well, and try not to drown. Okay, so which one of these S branches should you choose? In general, there are two that are easy and two that are hard. So Snake and Swamp are probably your first choices. Now, you're going to want to have poison resistance in these two more than the other two, though poison resistance is good in all of them. So, in general, lean towards Snake and Swamp. Make sure that you can defend against the elemental damages that these two present. And if you can, go with those ones. In general, the other two are much harder but have specific counters. So, if you have high AoE poison damage, Spider's Nest might be a good option for you. And if you can fly, have cold resistance, and clarity, say, then Shoals is actually relatively easy. And so you just want to check what resistances do I have? What kind of spells do I have? What is my offensive game plan? And go from there. And of course, if you need a shield early on, your best bet is Snake. And if you need, say, Poison Dragon Scales to get the poison resistance in the first place, Swamp will give that to you and is probably less of a threat against your poison resistance or lack thereof than the other options would be. And so you can get some scales, level up your armor, level up your resistances, and then take the other S branches after that. So the other option you have in addition to S branches is Vault. So I like to go Vaults 1 through 4 at some point in order to get really good experience, usually some good loot, good chance for shops, etc. And if you have a good, well-rounded base of defenses, then Vaults oftentimes is actually easier than the S branches are in some sense. Like the damage is higher, sure, but it's all very straightforward for the most part. The enemies are very straightforward. And we'll talk more about Vaults specifically in just a second, but you could decide after you get your first ruin, should I take the other S branch or should I go into Vaults? And rather than going to Shoals or Spider, which require very specific strategy, tactics, and gear potentially, you can always consider Vaults. You could only do a couple levels of it to get a little more experience, or find another spell, or what have you, right? I oftentimes do this. As long as you have one ruin, you can get into Vaults and get back out. With no ruins, you get locked in the Vaults until you get the ruin or die. So you want to do one S branch. And then the question is, do you do the second S branch or do you do Vaults? And that's kind of always a general question you can ask yourself. So let's talk Vaults. The danger of Vaults largely comes from these three enemies here. The Thunderhawks can do large amounts of smite targeted electrical damage. And so I like to have electrical resistance before going into Vault. The Convokers, which are the yellow guys, will summon enemies from all over the floor to your location. And this can be good or bad. If you're sitting in a really powerful position, maybe you got a bunch of summons out, it's a great time to have some more enemies on the board. Other times you're trying to run away and they're summoning in all kinds of stuff to stop you from getting away. For instance, they might be summoning in the red guys, which are the wardens, and they will lock doors, lock you in rooms, lock you with enemies, lock you away from stairs. They can lock stairways as well. So these sorts of things together can be really dangerous. And of course, there's also enemies that mark you. And so you've got to kind of come prepared for a generic fight for the most part. There's not that much elemental damage outside of electricity. There's some fire once in a while, some cold. The frost guys, the cold enemies, only do cold damage on the walls. So if you're standing in an open space rather than against a wall, you prevent the cold damage for the most part. So otherwise, you just have to watch out for really heavy hitting ranged damage. So that's physical, and some willpower checks as well, like sphinxes, things like that. So sometimes Vaults is easier. If you have high physical damage and electrical defense, and you can handle these specific enemies, then oftentimes it's safer than that second S branch. And I always like to get Vaults 1 through 4 in every game for that experience and the extra gear. Okay, so let's do a halfway point recap. You've gone through the dungeon and the lair and orc, where you'll find 4 guaranteed shops. That allows you to get the resistances you need, maybe find some spell books to help you get sorted for the S branches. And then at that point, you're picking your first S branch. I recommend snake or swamp to start out with, depending on what type of loot you need. So if you need scales, you go swamp. If you need shields, you go snake. And then you're debating with yourself, am I going to vaults to pick up more experience and gear, or am I going to that second S branch? And you can go back and forth between the two depending on how you're feeling in either one. Likewise, around this time, you can ask yourself, do I still need more loot or experience? And the 2 best options, if the answer is yes, are either elf or crypt. So elf is probably the more common answer. The enemies in general are less tanky. They do higher damage overall, but it's all straightforward magic caster type damage. There's some archers and there's some melee dudes. It's a great place to pick up magic related gear. So that's spell books, it's magical rings and amulets, evocables, things like that. Really good place to find all of that. Also, if you're melee dude and you need weapons, the Hall of, what's it called? Hall of Swords? Or whatever on Elf 2 has some great weapons for you. Crypts, on the other hand, has a heavier leaning towards necromantic gear, summoning, and it has some enemies that torment, do negative damage, etc. So if you have negative resistance, then Crypt is going to be easier in general. It also helps if you have something like LRD or Shatter to do damage to the skeletons. And if you have AoE damage, poison, etc., then Elf is probably your better bet. The one major difference in Elf is that you'd like some willpower to prevent banishment. So those are always good options to consider potentially doing every game, one or the other. Probably don't need both, but if you're really feeling weak, then both is a fine solution. So now we get on to our third ruin. And my choice in every game for the third ruin is slime. I'll tell you why in a minute. But if you're going into slime, your threats you have to watch out for here are largely physical. There's some cold and acid damage as well, but I don't really feel you need resistances to those types of damage. You want armor, you want shield, and then you want something to prevent mutation, which comes from the shining eyes. So as long as you can block line of sight or kill them really quickly, silver javelins, for instance, help a lot here, then you can prevent those mutations. Then once you get into the Royal Jelly fight, you need something that can do large amounts of AoE damage for when the jelly spawns its friends. So something as simple as the Scroll of Immolation can solve Slime 5 and the Royal Jelly on its own. Obviously, something like Ignition is better, summonings help, but really any character can beat this with just a single Scroll of Immolation. So that's basically one reason why we pick slime. It has an easy solution, but also we don't pick Vaults 5 or Abyss as our third ruin because of what slime doesn't have, which is lots and lots of chaos. So the Abyss is obviously chaotic because there's no end to the spawns. It's constant. The environment is constantly changing. You're constantly teleported around. You know, when Abyss goes well, it goes really well, and it's quick and easy and safe. When it goes poorly, it goes very, very poorly, and it feels awful because there's no time to rest. You're always on the run, many threats, things that are mutating you, etc. It's just awful when it goes poorly. Vaults is kind of the same way. You can have some easy solutions to them, right? Some of the same solutions that work in slime. But when it goes poorly because there's such a wide range of really powerful enemies and they swarm you. And so some of the best tactics in vaults actually involve increasing RNG by reading a teleport scroll before you go down into Vaults 5, for example, is really common, but that puts you somewhere random on the map, which could be really bad. And so I really dislike doing that. And I've had some deaths in Vault 5 that just seem silly when you could have instead gone to Slime and beat it with an immolation scroll. And so that's why I do recommend almost every character, almost all the time, go into Slime. It's quick, usually it's easy, it has simple solutions that every character has access to. So you've got your 3 ruins, and you've got your extra XP, and you've got your gear. You've gone into depths. What threats are we going to see here? Pretty much everything. There's really strong casters, there's really strong melee dudes, there are swarms of enemies, there's damage of all types. So by this point, you want a well-rounded character. And you want to have a stack of escape options, blink scrolls, teleports, translocation spells, etc. So the other thing that really helps with this beyond those things is game knowledge, because some of these enemies have really particular tricks and ways to counter them. The spellbook type enemies, for example, continuously spawn living spells. And so it's good to know what each of those spells are. But it's also a great time to use Yara's Violent Unraveling, because you can unravel those spells over and over right next to the books and get your kill using smite targeting. So you don't want to continually be hit by those living spells, because some of them do a ton of damage and they will target you despite you having summons out. Another enemy that requires a lot of game knowledge are the wormholes, which I'm showing here on the right. And new players are going to run up against this enemy and not know how to handle it, because it gives a debuff from range that is going to teleport you right next to enemies somewhere else on the map, and it comes with you. You can cancel that debuff by reading a teleport scroll after it's hit you. So when you see the debuff teleport and the wormhole has hit you, just read a teleport scroll to cancel it. The other way to counter this enemy is to not let it in melee range, because it will blink with you if it hits you in melee range, and it'll blink you all over the place. And so keep it out of melee range, summons help, and even though it has a piercing breath, which gives you that teleport debuff, you can easily counter it using a teleport scroll. Finally, Zot. You better have your ducks in a row for this one. So not only are all the enemies really scary and have a wide range of elemental damages, but you've got mutators, you've got tormentors, and you've got debuffers. So I've put 4 of the enemies on screen here that you definitely want to watch out for. This is by no means an extensive list of everything to watch out for. So the Orb of Fire is the main thing people are planning for. And 1 pip of fire resistance is okay. They will still certainly kill you through that. 2 pips and 3 pips absolutely wrecks Orbs of Fire in terms of defenses. You can basically stand there and tank. They will mutate you, of course, but this is where summons come in to lend an extra helping hand to prevent the mutation from going off. You want to have high direct damage for these, so things like LCS and Bombard are really good. Summons in general are really good. And anything that can really just do direct damage to insubstantial creatures, that's what you want. Once again, your Silver Javelins would come in handy here. The Cursed Toes are a strange enemy too, because they can do Torment from range and they summon Surrounding. Now those enemies that they summon Surrounding are not very strong. They're little mushroom dudes. But when you're also surrounded by Draconians or other Zot enemies, they can pose a real threat in a teamwork kind of way. So you always want to focus down a Cursed Toe as soon as it gets on screen. The Death Cob and the Clowns are both debuffers. So the Death Cobs are really fast, and if they get into melee range, they'll hit you with a slow. The Clowns, on the other hand, can silence you, they can give you vertigo, or do other nasty debuffs. Negative potion too, I think. So some really, really bad stuff. All of these debuffs can be canceled using a cancellation potion. And so if you get caught out by some of these debuffs, make sure you have cancellation potions on hand. The Cobs in particular are pretty easy to work around. If you have any kind of movement abilities, Summon Surprising Crocodile works well. Any kind of summon works well in these guys as well. So overall, though, for Zot, you want all your resistances as good as you can get. I like 2 pips of fire resistance at least. 1 you can get by. You want direct damage, but you also want AoE to deal with the hordes of Draconians. And then you want to use all your escapes and pots when you need them, because at this point it's time to pull out the stops. This is the last zone besides the orb run itself. And so you've got the Orb of Zot, and it's time to get out. Your threats here are going to be spawns that happen in your general vicinity as you get up through the dungeon. And they can be things you haven't seen before. Often they are. In a 3 ruin run, they're going to be pulling from the extended in-game enemy pool. And so the number 1 threat that you're going to find are Panlords. These are randomly generated enemies with an assortment of spells. Oftentimes they have distortion branded attacks. They're fast, they're flying, they can see invis. Not all of them, but it's any kind of random mix of these abilities and spells and so on. And so I recommend always checking using the X button to look at them, XV, and see what exactly is the threat, what would be the counter, and does this threat require a blink scroll? Oftentimes they do. This is the point beyond Zot where you might as well just spend all your consumables, right? So use those blink scrolls, use the haste scrolls, use invis when enemies can't see it. You're also likely to see fast enemies, demons, and even angels, all of which can pose an assortment of different types of threats to your character, depending on if you're undead or not, what you're weak to. Some of the demons do irresistible damage and so on. So in general, I am a run, don't fight kind of player. If you can kill the things quick without stopping your forward movement, like by using summons or Hellfire Mortar, then great, fantastic. It's more like a collateral damage type thing. But the main goal is get to the upstair and keep moving. The fewer consumables you have to spend, the fewer turns you have to spend, then the fewer enemies you're going to see. And at this point, the only goal is surviving. The point isn't to level or get gear or anything like that. Just get out. So as a final recap, starting with dungeon, you go down to D10 or D11, depending on whether or not you can be shafted from D11. You don't want that to happen, so you should go into Lair instead if it's possible. Once you finish Lair and you head back to dungeon, go down to D15, usually, and then go into Orc. You could go into Orc earlier if you have some great AoE skills or something like that. And in Orc, you're going to find 4 guaranteed shops. Use those shops to get ready for the next set of branches, which are the S branches. Choose the easier ones first. Choose it based on what resistances you have and what kind of gear you need. After you get your first ruin, you can go back and forth between vaults 1 through 4 and the second S branches, depending on what you're prepared for. Then you can ask yourself, do I need more experience, spells, resistances, etc.? And pick either Elf or Crep based on if you have negative energy resistance versus willpower and elemental resistances. Then I recommend Slime for the 3rd ruin. And then you can make your way through Depths, Zot, and right back out. That's the end of my branch order guide for Dungeon Crawl. I hope new players find that useful. Let me know down in the comments if you do something a little bit differently. I've come to this conclusion over a long series of games, mostly on the Gnoll, but also on other characters like the Gargoyle. And I think that this, in general, is probably the optimal way to go. So, good luck out there. Hope I see you in the next one.